Hello, I'm Ana Cabrera in for Kate Baldwin, and it is a morning of breaking news and big headlines at the White House. Just minutes ago, we learned that President Trump is open to accepting a brand new invitation from Russia's president. Vladimir Putin has invited President Trump to Moscow, and this comes just hours after sources told CNN that the president's former attorney, Michael Cohen, is ready to talk to special counsel Robert Mueller and deliver a potential bombshell in the Russia investigation. CNN's Jeff Zeleny is at the White House for us. Jeff, this has been a whirlwind 24 hours. Let's just start with the very latest, this new invitation from President Putin.
No question. Good morning. The fallout from that Helsinki summit is indeed continuing with this back and forth between Washington and Moscow over will there be a second meeting between the two presidents. Now, we are learning this morning, just a few moments ago, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said that President Trump is open to going to Moscow if he has a formal invitation. And they also say they still look forward to having Vladimir Putin here in the U.S. after the first of the year. Of course, this is a bit of a walk back from last week when he invited him here in the fall, which, of course, many Republicans across Washington were saying should not happen during or right after the midterm elections. Now, of course, this is all coming on the heels of that strong economic news. As you said, Anna, we saw the president in the South Lawn of the White House really talking about this economic growth, 4.1% growth of a GDP in the second quarter, certainly very strong, a sign of a robust economy. Of course, there are questions, can this be sustained or not? But without a doubt, very good news here. But Anna, if that was the main headline of the day, that would indeed be a good news for this administration. But so many self-inflicted wounds, if you will, still coming from these variety of controversies and investigations and secret tape recordings that are still coming from a variety of effects before the president took office. The latest, of course, Michael Cohen, that bombshell development where he is now alleging that President Trump, then candidate Trump, knew about that Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016. Of course, President Trump has repeatedly denied that, said he did not know. So many developments on that front with Michael Cohen, the White House watching that very carefully. Last night, Anna, I was told that the president's mood was growing increasingly more worried about this investigation. So certainly the strong economic news, good news here, and the administration really would be off to a great start if it was not for those self-inflicted wounds of the investigations on it.
All those Russia headlines. Jeff Zeleny at the White House for us. Thank you. Let's find out more now about what Moscow is saying about this possible upcoming summit. CNN's Matthew Chance joins us from Russia. Now, what are you hearing there?
Well, all this, of course, Anna, stems from a press conference that was being given by Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, in South Africa. Is attending an economic summit, a BRICS summit there with various other world leaders from emerging markets. And he was talking to Russian journalists, and he made this point. He said, we are ready to invite President Trump to Moscow. And then he went on and said, in fact, he already has this invitation already. And I told him about it. And so indicating there, President Putin, the president of Russia, that invitation had already been extended. It's not clear when it was extended. In fairness, it may have been at that closed-door meeting that the two presidents had in Helsinki. Certainly, the Russians have been much more upfront about revealing details of what was actually discussed in that room without any witnesses apart from the translators during the Helsinki summit. But again, it's poured fuel onto the fire of this controversy of the ongoing relationship and the contacts between Russia and the United States, or at least their two presidents. President Putin also taking the time to praise Donald Trump during his answer to the questions being posed by Russian journalists in South Africa, saying that the thing with President Trump, his great virtue is that he always wants to keep his promises to his voters. A reference perhaps to the fact that Trump, during his campaign, said he wanted to make a better relationship with Russia, and Russia, from the Russian point of view, he is insisting on continuing to do that. Anna.
He obviously has been listening to President Trump, too, and talk about how much he is doing as far as keeping those promises to the voters, to those people who he needs in his base. Matthew Chance, live in Moscow. Thank you. Joining us now, CNN Global Affairs correspondent Elise Labott and CNN International Diplomatic Editor Nick Robertson. So, Elise, why all of this back and forth and drama involving these future meetings between President Trump and Putin?
Well, it's a great point, Anna. I think one thing that President Putin might be doing is just trying to continue what he's always wanted to do, which is create chaos in the U.S. political system. He saw how much controversy was caused by that second invitation by the president to Washington. Then after a while, President Putin did not respond. They were kind of leaving the White House hanging. And then President Trump said, well, I'm not going to have this meeting. I'm going to wait until the Mueller investigation. He called it a witch hunt is over. And now that the White House is starting to recover, President Trump announces that he issued this invitation. So I think he's taking a little bit of perverse pleasure on it. But I think another thing that's really struck me in all this is that I think President Putin may be starting to figure out that all this deferential nature by President Trump to President Putin is creating a little bit of a liability for the president, for President Putin. You saw at that press conference him trying to help President Trump out, say, well, we don't agree on Crimea. We don't agree on a lot of things. And so I think that President Putin is not really getting what he thought that he would get from President Trump because of this political firestorm.
Nick, how is the rest of the world, especially U.S. allies, likely to view this?
Yeah, I think what we heard from President Putin today, with part of his statement being that he will meet again with President Trump, but only if certain conditions are met. And I think the rest of the world is going to be looking on, as they have been since the Helsinki summit last week, to try to figure out precisely what was said, what was agreed, what was firm, what wasn't, what was ideas that were exchanged between President Putin and President Trump. Is President Putin here signaling to President Trump that certain conditions need to be met, i.e. you need to make good on some of what we discussed during that meeting? And I think if that is the case, then the international community will certainly be looking to see what they are, what those agreements were. Was it on Crimea? Was it on Syria? What are the implications? How will it affect them? How will it affect their national security view as the United States as a good, strong, solid ally? Because after the president's visit to NATO, that remains an ongoing question for a lot of people. So I think it'll be viewed in that kind of context. Having said all of that, of course, I mean, it is generally viewed that for Washington to have a dialogue with Moscow is fundamental to part of global security and stability. So it's going to be welcomed, but it's in the details and what President Putin has said. Those conditions, what are they and what are the implications of them?
I mean, it is still such a mystery, that first summit. We don't know the details of what was discussed, what was maybe agreed upon, what areas they plan to work together or in conflict with each other on. Elise, do you get the sense that Putin is trying to play up their personal rapport, the fact that they have this one-on-one connection?
I do, and the reason why, Anna, is because we don't know what came out of this summit, but when you talk to officials and diplomats, they say, well, nothing is coming out of the summit because there's been no announcements from President Trump. There's been no instructions to his staff that, yes, the National Security Councils are going to meet, but it's almost what happened in that meeting and those pleasantries are really all they have. Because if President Trump isn't going to brief on what happened and where things go from there, then nothing is really going to change in the relationship. And so that better relationship between Trump and Putin, and possibly that helping Putin on the world stage right now, is all the two men have, because things between the U.S. and Russia are exactly as they were before the summit.
And I wanted to read the exact words that we heard from President Putin in Russia today when he was talking in Johannesburg. He says there has to be necessary conditions, but he's ready to come to Washington. He wants President Trump to go to Moscow. Nick, you referenced those possible conditions. What could they be, do you think? Is he saying, like, you can't ask about Russia meddling, you can only talk about Syria? What do you think it is?
You know, you would expect him to want to have sanctions lifted on Russia right now. You would expect him to want to be able to have an economic benefit in the longer term from this meeting, something that he could show to the Russian people that he is getting something out of this, other than giving away a soccer ball and appearing to be the sort of having the whip hand there in Helsinki. So he's going to want to have something for his domestic audience, and I think perhaps that is it. More than just a handshake, more than just smiles, more than just the good atmosphere, because the economy in Russia is hurting, and that is a huge political issue for President Putin. Syria, an engagement with the United States more actively on a political outcome in Syria could be something else. And also the issue of Crimea, Ukraine, how to tackle that, where Putin is positioned on that vis-a-vis. United States. All of these things. But I think there's another thing we can look at here as well. Look, let's play the long game here for a second, which is what Putin does. This guy's been leader in Russia effectively for 18 years, 2 terms president, term prime minister, and is on his 2nd term as president now. This is his last term as president. 6 more years. If President Trump gets re-elected, if the relationship is good between the 2 countries in 6 years' time, he has more leeway, you would imagine, to fumble around the political system of Russia and come up with an outcome that still leaves him in ultimate power there. This is still a lot about the 2 men, about their egos, about their positions of power and influence. And Putin, you have to know at this time, is looking that 6 years down the road to position himself for continuing authority.